Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another edition of our series, Meet the Mayor. And we're delighted today to be joined by the mayor of Evanston, Dan Biss. Daniel has an amazingly interesting story. Was born in Akron, Ohio, grew up in Bloomington, Indiana, where his parents were music professors at IU. Dan's interest was mathematics and studied math both at Harvard as an undergrad and MIT as a graduate student. His first job out of college was to be a PhD professor, a math professor at the University of Chicago. Taught that for a while, and then his interest in politics blossomed. He and his wife moved to Evanston. He ran for the Illinois General Assembly, the House, won in 2010, was elected to the Senate 2012, ran a really impressive and principled campaign for governor in 2018, finishing second in the Democratic primary, and then was elected mayor of Evanston in 2021, has been in office for not quite a year, about 6, 7, 8 months, and is doing some really interesting work, and we're delighted to talk with him today. Mr. Mayor, good to see you.
Hey, it's great seeing you, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, I alluded to your parents being in the music world, and I think one of your brothers as well. So tell me how a mathematician arose from those circumstances.
Yeah, they're still trying to figure it out. I mean, in fact, it's not only my parents and my brother, it's just the whole family. My grandmother was a cellist, my other grandmother was a piano teacher, my uncle played the piano, and then I sort of showed up as this black sheep, who was fascinated by something that nobody else in the family had done. But I guess it was my form of teenage rebellion was to get into math.
And I mean, was it one of those things that even as a young kid, it was just what your aptitude was, what your interest was? I mean, was there ever a moment when you thought was this so clear to you that this is where you wanted to spend your initial intellectual focus?
Absolutely. I mean, not when I was, let's say 7 or something. When I was in elementary school, I had an aptitude for it. I did well. I was a little bit accelerated, but it was just going to school and coming home again. But by the time I was probably about a sophomore in high school, I was just completely entranced by the subject, totally in love with it. And I often tell people this, and it's true. I kind of skipped the usual "what do you want to be when you grow up" period of your life, because I knew by the time I was, like I said, a sophomore in high school that I wanted to go to college and grad school for mathematics and wind up being a math professor. And I didn't really think it over or reflect on it very much, not only in high school or even in college. And it wasn't until later that I began to think, well, I do really love this subject matter, but maybe there are other interests I have that I ought to explore as well.
Well, tell us a little bit about teaching math at the University of Chicago. I mean, that must be a pretty challenging position. I mean, you have amazingly bright students. Tell a little bit about that. And you were 25, I think, when you started out at U of C.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I turned 25 that year. You know, First of all, unlike some academics, I love teaching. Love it. I love the feeling of being in the classroom and trying to explain something. I love the one-on-one work where you're kind of trying to share a material with somebody and find the specific way that breaks through and connects with them on a human level. I just love that stuff. So it was a joy for sure. The thing about the U of C that was really unique for me which was exciting, is just how broadly curious the students were. So like the example I always give is one of the first classes I taught was it's kind of a upper level undergraduate course in topology, which is a subject that, a mathematician needs to learn and maybe some theoretical physicists need to learn. And practically speaking, nobody else needs to know it. And if you were to go to another institution, and that includes other equally elite institutions, the kids in that class would be, pretty much all math or physics majors. And so here I show up to teach it on the first day at University of Chicago, and I have classics majors and biology majors and political science majors and philosophy majors who are all just really curious about this subject that was, advanced and complicated and very much an elective and totally outside their field of concentration, but they just kind of dug the subject matter, and that was fun. It made teaching harder, right? Because they weren't necessarily steeped in the subject the way that the math majors were, but it made it really fun. I remember office hours were a total blast because they would teach me as much as I would teach them. So it was a really invigorating environment. And I was honestly pretty lucky to be there.
Well, was it a hard decision to leave? And then you and your wife, I think, moved up to Evanston in 2006. And tell us about the transition from the academic world to the political world.
Yeah, so the geography part is simple. Karen and I got married in 2006, and she was about to start a PhD in history at Northwestern, and so it just felt like, I was at U of C, but I already kind of had one foot in the political world, and so I was on campus twice a week. She was going to be a first year graduate student, on campus every day. It just seemed like, let's go to a place where she can bike to campus and really be immersed in the graduate student culture. But in terms of the transition, like I said earlier, I dove into math as a career starting from when I was, 15, let's say. And that was because I loved the subject. And sure enough, I love the subject, but, maybe a 15-year-old doesn't know themselves that well. And I found myself as I was going through the education and math feeling like, yeah, the subject's super interesting, but there's all these other kind of more human issues, the social problems of the world around me that I'm really passionate about. And I feel pretty walled off from them being in this extremely abstract ivory tower environment. And that manifested itself in a variety of different ways when I was in graduate school, and I was kind of searching a little bit for an outlet for my more kind of human and public service related interests. But then when I came to the U of C, it was 2002, so it was a year after, I arrived in the fall of '02, so a year after the September 11th attacks, and half a year before the U.S. went to war in Iraq, and it just felt like the nation was kind of coming apart, and there was this dramatic dishonesty occurring with horrible human consequences, and this switch flipped in my mind, which it should flip in your mind when you take government class in the 8th grade or something, or 5th grade, not when you're in your mid-20s and a professional. But I was a little late, I guess, where I stopped thinking of what was being done by our government as something that they were doing and began thinking of it as something that we were doing. And if it was something that we were doing, I had a responsibility to change it if I felt like it was morally wrong. Now, that didn't mean I had to change my profession, but it meant I all of a sudden felt a compulsion to be far more directly personally involved in public life. And I started showing up to meetings and doing organizing, and that ultimately led me to just fall in love with the idea that you could organize ordinary people to make change, that you could have, notwithstanding the complexity of the system and how stuck and controlled everything sometimes feels, if you got a lot of people who just cared passionately about the same thing and were strategic enough and persistent enough, you could actually make change. And I fell in love with that idea and doing that work, and that's what ultimately led me to run for office.
Well, you ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, served in the House, Illinois House, and the Illinois Senate. How do you look back on the Springfield years in terms of both your kind of indoctrination to public policy, what surprised you, what disappointed you, what excited you? How do you think of the Springfield years?
Well, it was an incredible education. I loved the work, loved it. I was there for 8 years, and honestly, there were two starkly different halves because we had two different governors. During my first 4 years, Pat Quinn was the governor, and during my second 4 years, Bruce Rauner was the governor. So, when Pat Quinn was the governor, everything felt very difficult. We were just kind of beginning to come out of the Great Recession, and the budget problems were enormously severe. And we had Democrats in control and Democrats fighting with Democrats all the time. Then, of course, Rauner became governor, and I didn't realize how good we'd had it before. And the struggle between and I have lots of opinions and feelings about this, but I also try to explain it as objectively as I can. That the struggle between Rauner and the legislature was just so damaging to the state. I mean, obviously, you're a public university, and so you saw it in a really, really intense and horrible way. but it wasn't limited to that. The consequences for social service providers and education and the state's budget, it was just devastating, and it was unbelievably frustrating and painful to see everything so stuck and not really be able to do much about it. But broadly speaking, when I think back to those 8 years, um, I feel really it was just exciting to figure out how to make something happen that you thought could help people. I passed a lot of legislation, and obviously, some of it was pretty inconsequential, right? But some of it really made a difference in people's lives, and there were things that I was able to push through that I strongly believed were the right thing to do, would make a difference for people, and that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have been there with that passion and that willingness to just kind of put my shoulder to the wheel. And I think that's a really important lesson, because again, I think politics and government can feel very stuck to people, and they are in some circumstances, in some really critical circumstances. But I found that, just as one person in the legislature, I could make a difference, and that was an incredible privilege.
Well, we've talked to several state reps in various series, and the one sort of constant is that while there's this almost endless fighting on the kind of the big picture issues of budget and taxes, below that tier of issues, there's a fair amount of cooperation on scores of issues that are more technical than they are ideological. And I remember I read something, an interview you talked about, in which you were participating in a conference committee. And you said it was this like wonderful experience because you are working across the aisle, across the chambers, and there was this just kind of serious people who didn't necessarily agree, just trying to solve problems. Talk about that if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different components of this that are worth talking about. First of all, it's exactly as you said. I agree completely. There's the issues that make the headlines, where the partisan combatants pick up their artillery and go to war, and then there's like 85% of the issues that aren't like that, where there might be a technical issue, or there might be even an issue that's about policy decisions and values, but it just doesn't line up quite right, left, DR. And there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of good people trying to work together. The other thing to say, though, and I hate to sort of make a fetish out of this, because I think we sometimes exaggerate the extent to which this is how Washington used to operate, and it's a day that we rue. But we had social relationships across the aisle. Like, one example, and I'll say this particularly given where you're sitting in Carbondale, I think a lot about the really lovely dinner that I had a couple times with Mike Bost. Now, Mike Bost is not somebody with whom I agree with about almost any public policy issue. And by the way, his most famous moment as a elected official prior to becoming a member of Congress was sort of throwing a partisan temper tantrum on the floor of the Illinois House and throwing stuff in the air and all that. And it was really great for the cameras. But he was also somebody who, behind the scenes, I was able to just have a normal human conversation with. And we didn't try to convince each other about the enormous number of things we disagreed about, but it also meant that when there was something that we didn't disagree about passionately, we had that foundation that we could draw on to work together. And I think that's good for policymaking. And also, I hate to say this, is a very selfish thing to say, but also it's just good for us, the legislators themselves as human beings. That I grew so much being exposed to people from all over the state, from all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different value systems, all kinds of different priorities. Priorities is another thing about this. It's really critical, right? Nobody tells you when you're elected to the Illinois legislature that you've got to focus on this one thing. You just sort of bring the thing you personally care about. And the beauty of the legislature is you've got 177 different people who probably have 150 different idiosyncratic sets of passions and interests and things that really they believe will most impact their own communities. And if you go there with an open mind and an open heart, you find yourself learning an awful lot. Now, Mike Boss didn't convince me about any of the values differences that we hold. I hold those values that he disagrees with just as strongly today as I did then, and I bet he does too. But I was able to grow in other ways that were really productive to me as a human being and as a legislator.
Well, let's talk about your campaign for mayor of Evanston. We'll have another conversation about your gubernatorial race because that was a whole another story in itself. In which, as I said, you ran this really principled and interesting and quite successful campaign, finishing second in a crowded primary. But so in 2021 or probably 2020, you decide to run for mayor of Evanston, and your agenda you said was bold, progressive city government. And you listed three or four areas in particular, and I wonder if we could talk about them just kind of to set this up. You talked about public safety, which you were careful to say is beyond just policing. It's a much broader way of approaching the challenges we face. You talked about climate and sustainability, housing, equity and transparency, economic development. So tell us why you ran for mayor of Evanston.
Well, fundamentally, I felt like this was a really big moment for municipal government in a lot of different ways, right? So part of it is, of course, the pandemic, which is, an unspeakable challenge and one that raises the stakes of government, right? You got to get government right in a moment like this. And so that I think is obvious, but really critical and made it feel like, hey, if I do this well, that's going to really help a lot of people. But part of it is that on some policy questions, I just felt like we're at a kind of tipping point moment where good decision making could really make a difference. Public safety is one really critical example where there's a conversation going on around the country about what is the right way to provide for public safety. There's been kind of a trend in one direction for 50 years, and I think people are trying to figure out what's the right way to balance our investment. So, for example, and I want to start by saying we've got a really good police department in Evanston and excellent, dedicated police officers who are really committed to a humanistic and sensitive way of providing for public safety. But we had an unspeakable tragedy in town a week ago yesterday that we're still really reeling from. There was a shooting at a gas station where 5 young people, 2 young men or boys really, and 2 young women or girls were targeted. 1 did not survive. The other 4 were all shot as well. 1 still in critical condition. And so our community is trying to cope with the fact that we've lost a minor, and this kind of senseless violence can occur. And we're going to have to be doing a lot of work to figure out how to react to this and how to prevent things like this from occurring in the future. Well, our police department is absolutely critical in doing the investigation, and they're doing really important, good work. But I don't think most people believe that traditional policing could have stopped this from occurring because it was so targeted and so focused. And even if we tripled the size of our police force, they wouldn't be at every corner all the time. That's just not feasible. And so a different thing that we need to be doing is more outreach to prevent violence before it occurs. Violence to intervene with disconnected youth who are heading in a troubling direction where people who work with them on the street can see, you know what, if this trajectory continues, this person might be involved in a shooting in 6 months. Youth who lack job opportunities or youth who perhaps don't recognize that there are job opportunities out there for them. And so this combination of direct on the street outreach with workforce development work and partnership with employers, that's all part of public safety. And if we don't think about those investments as a part of the response to public safety challenges, we're just leaving a lot of solutions on the table and then trying to fit a square peg into a round hole when it comes to deploying the capacities that we have built up. So that's an example of, I think, a pivot that's occurring in America right now that's really, really critical, and one that is going to happen on the municipal level entirely, nearly. And so having municipal leaders who are bold and ambitious and careful and thoughtful is I think, going to be really, really impactful. Another example of an issue like this is housing, where there's a growing affordable housing crisis in this country. And I think a growing recognition that part of that is really about the supply of housing. And so I'll give you an example. And this may not be that applicable in a place like Carbondale, given the space constraints that we have here that y'all don't in Carbondale. But I'm speaking to you from a modest townhome where my family of 4 lives in a sort of snug but comfortable comfortable situation. And we're able to afford this on our very, very middle class salaries. But the truth is, we couldn't afford to live in probably 90% of our own neighborhood. If you look right out the window there, all the houses out there, I could not afford to move to. And the reason for that is that the house that I live in here would be illegal to build right over there. And so we have all these rules, these land use ordinances that exist in Evanston, but also across the country, that are so restrictive about what could be built where that they choke off the supply of affordable housing. And there's a growing recognition about this too, that I think would allow us to make some really bold and ambitious and possibly controversial steps that will ultimately make this community more affordable and accessible for a lot of people, which I think will be good for us in the long term. So anyway, it's a long answer. You ask a policy wonk, a policy question, and he doesn't know how to shut his mouth. But the bottom line is I just felt like this was a moment where we could really do some exciting things that maybe the window to do that wasn't open 5 years ago. Maybe it won't be open again in 5 years. But right now, I just felt like, hey, a mayor who does a good job can really help make a pretty big difference.
Well, Daniel, let's give us a snapshot of Evanston. I know it's about 12 miles north of Chicago, the Chicago downtown. It's about 75,000. Of course, Northwestern is this world-class university. So fill out the profile of Evanston. What should people across Illinois know about your community?
Yeah, well, you covered a lot of the high points. They'll say we grew a little bit, so we're 78,000 in the new census. We're clinging to that 5% growth. We're about, I guess, 12 miles north of downtown Chicago, but we border Chicago. So, in the world where there's literally hundreds of Chicago suburbs, there's kind of three qualities of Evanston that are relatively central to who we are. One is we border Chicago. We're not far out there. By virtue of bordering it, we're right on all the transit lines. So, there's the L train or the subway goes right through Evanston, which is quite unusual for a suburb. But the commuter rail, the metro, also goes through Evanston as well. We're served by both different bus systems. So we're pretty close in and on the transit lines, which makes us attractive as a bedroom community. So a lot of, back when there was no pandemic, you have a lot of Evanstonians hopping on the train in the morning and working downtown Chicago in white collar jobs. Second, as you mentioned, Northwestern University. So it's a elite private research university that, obviously it's not the same size as the public Big Ten schools, so it doesn't exert quite the same force on the community as UIUC does on Urbana-Champaign, or frankly that SIU does on Carbondale. But it's a significant factor. You've got a ton of students, you've got a ton of faculty, you've got a lot of, again, before the pandemic, a lot of travel coming through, and everybody knows the sort of feel of a college town is a little different than the feel of a non-college town, and we have quite a bit of that here in Evanston. And then finally, we're along the lakefront. And so we have, that's just an amenity and an attraction that most suburbs don't have the good fortune of having, and we do. So those are the sort of kind of physical features of the town. We're a very diverse community. So we have an African-American community in Evanston with deep roots. There are a lot of Black Evanstonians whose roots in this town go back 3 or even 4 or 5 generations. There's kind of a proud history of a middle-class Black community here, and an ugly history of segregation, and not just segregation, but a variety of consequences that come with that, like segregated schools and educational inequities, and really significant gaps in other public services. Just look at kind of where the sidewalks are well built in town, and you can see what the historically Black neighborhoods are. We're in aggregate an affluent community, but that's not universal. So there's middle-class people, and there's real poverty in Evanston as well. And we're a very progressive community politically. So Joe Biden got north of 90% of the vote in Evanston, and we're represented at every layer of government exclusively by Democrats. In fact, when I won the race to join the Illinois House of Representatives in 2010, that flipped the last seat at any level of government that overlapped Evanston and was occupied by a Republican. So that's sort of a window into it, and it's a unique community for those reasons. If you look at all those different features and put them all together, you you tell a story that is different than any other community in the state, and therefore this is a lot of people who are here because they really want to be in Evanston, and that leads to a very engaged community, right? It's not so much that people just happen to be on this side of the border or that; they see themselves as Evanstonians, and so they participate in Evanston's public life in a very, very intense and passionate way, which makes my job much harder and much better, much more interesting, much richer, and much more meaningful.
If someone were to go to a diner in Evanston now and talk to people and say, what are the two or three issues related to the city of Evanston are top of mind? What do you think they would say?
Well, today there's absolutely no question. They talk about public safety, and they would tell you about the shooting that occurred 8 days ago. It's just, understandably, it's on my mind as a resident and a parent too, but it's on my mind as mayor a lot because I see it's on the minds of our community tremendously. So that is clearly at the top of the list. We're also a community, like many, of course, that's very passionate about education. Not only because Northwestern's here, but our public schools are a center of our communal life. We have, a high school district, which is one high school, which is a wonderful school, Evanston Township High School, and then a K through 8 district, which with, of course, many more schools than that. And, like in a lot of places, education is a lightning rod. The elections for school board last April were very, very contentious with a lot of conversation about curriculum and school reopenings and how to handle COVID. And that issue is just always on folks' minds here. And the success of our schools is fundamental to what makes people want to be here.
Well, you've been mayor since May. What surprises you about the job? What has sort of unfolded as you expected?
Well, let me answer the surprise part first in two parts. There's the stuff that I just didn't know to expect, but if I run for re-election, will not surprise me. And then there's the stuff that came at me that was a surprise because it were just events that cropped up. So I would say, coming from the legislature, the shift from the legislature to municipal government that's been really interesting and a very exciting education for me is that people's involvement is different. People's involvement is much more hands-on, and I think there's almost less of an expectation of representative government. Right? When I was a legislator, people had opinions. Got a ton of public input. I engaged with the public all the time, but ultimately they were trying to persuade me because they really felt like they had elected me to go be the representative. Whereas local government is much more participatory. And so it's not so much we're going to vote for you and then send you off to City Hall to run the government. It's we're going to vote for you and then sit with you at the table and work with you to make sure the government is running the way that we want it to be run, which is, again, it's a different model, and it's really invigorating to work through that as someone who's new to that kind of situation. But then just, it just feels like it's been a nonstop series of surprises. So, some good, some terrible, some just surprising. But one episode that has really been central in my time as mayor that is catastrophic is that I guess less than 2 months before I took office, it emerged that there had been a terrible allegations of misconduct on the lakefront. So I mentioned that we're on the lake. Well, a lot of that beach is city property, and the beaches are maintained by the city. So the lifeguards and everyone who works there are city employees. Well, there were horrifying, genuinely horrifying allegations of sexual misconduct among employees with other employees on the lakefront. And it turned out that though those allegations had been made almost a year before I became the mayor, they'd kind of been, they'd not come to light. I would argue they'd even really been suppressed by some. And so we had to figure out, how to take the appropriate action regarding the substance of the allegations, but also how to get to the bottom of how something like that could have not come to light, given how unbelievably critical it was. And so we're still working through that. We have an independent, highly respected firm doing an investigation, but that obviously kind of became a focal point that was a tremendous surprise. The city manager left relatively early on. We're now kind of halfway through, I would say, a search for a new city manager, which is of course a critical decision for the city. So just there's been a lot of fluidity that's been stuff that got thrown at me that I couldn't have possibly expected. In terms of what was like I expected, first of all, there's a lot of great people who work for the city, a lot of great people who live in the city and want to step up and be involved in the conversations. And that's been really just a joy. But also in terms of the issues that I thought were critical, they have been the issues that I still believe to be critical and that I still believe our community believes are critical. Public safety, climate, housing, equity. These are the things that I think the reason the job is exciting for me is that I think that if we get those right, we make a big difference. And I think the community believes the same thing. And when those two views are aligned, you have an opportunity to really do something good.
I read an interview in which you said the one thing that you've really been excited about is the fact that there's 9 aldermen, as I understand it, and maybe in the past there had been sort of two competing blocks that just kind of hammered each other back and forth. But now you use the word fluidity, that they're now kind of shifting coalitions that are focused on specific issues and problems. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because historically in Evanston, and I think this is, look, I'm a partisan guy. I'm a Democrat, and I think there's nothing wrong with partisanship. But most municipal governments are nonpartisan, and the upside of a nonpartisan government should be exactly that, right? That you don't have trench warfare on this side versus that side on every issue, and instead, hey, maybe on this issue, here's your majority that's going to work together and advance a particular vision, and on some different issue, a totally different coalition comes together. That's how Evanston city government used to work. But in recent years, they had kind of moved away from that. I don't know if that's true in other municipalities, and maybe it'd be a sign of our polarized time, or maybe it's just a coincidence that happened to occur in Evanston. But in any case, in the last several years, there kind of had emerged 2 blocks that were really at odds with each other. And in the last, 3 years, 2 years before I became mayor, if you said, hey, Daniel, there was a 7-2 vote at city council today, I could tell you with 90% certainty who were the 7 and who were the 2. If you said there's a 6-3 vote, I would be pretty darn sure who the 6 were and who the 3 were. And then in the campaign that happened, before the April election, it kind of looked the same way. The 2 factions were kind of duking it out. But now that the election's over and folks have taken office, you can still see those coalitions, which is appropriate and healthy. I'm not asking people to not have close colleagues who they tend to align with. But on different issues, the coalitions have really shifted. On issues of kind of government transparency, there's a particular block that feels a particular way. On issues of affordability, that block splits when it comes to kind of housing policy, and a different majority is formed. And I just think that's really healthy. There's only 9 of them, 10 counting me. We all have to be able to work together if we want to be able to make progress on all the different issues that come before us. And to me, that, as you said, the fluidity, the coalitions shifting depending on the issue, it's a good sign in terms of what we're going to be able to accomplish, but it's also just a sign of integrity, right? That the council members aren't just siding with the person they like or siding against the person they tend to disagree with. They're figuring out how to best advance their own values and the interests of the ward they represent, and working with anybody to get that done. And I think they're to be commended for that.
Well, this year, Evanston was named an All-American City, which won a lot of attention, I think, across the state. And also related to that was the work of an equity and an empowerment commission that was instrumental in putting together a reparations program. Tell us about maybe just more broadly the All-American City designation, and then the reparations policy. We've gotten a lot of questions on those, and I'm sure that's something that is, what Evanston has become really known for throughout the country.
Yeah, well, the All-American City designation was a great honor. I believe we were the only city in Illinois, one of, I think, 10 or fewer in the country to have this designation. And, we just feel really proud of it. We think that it's both a recognition specifically around our reparations work, of the fact that this little town of 78,000 people is able to take a first step on a truly weighty, pivotal national issue, and really, hopefully, lead the country in coming to grips with this question. And it's also simultaneously a recognition of the other things that we do well. The fact that we're a great place to live, that we're a desirable community that has great schools, and just as a place that people certainly across the Chicago area tend to see as, oh, hey, that's a place I'd like to move to. Which brings us back to the question of why housing affordability is so important. When people want to come be where you are, people are ultimately our greatest strength. And so the more people that we make Evanston affordable for, the stronger we'll be. Our reparations program is something we take great pride in. I don't want to say, I'll say this because I think it's really important. For an issue as significant as this, as proud as I am of this, and as much as I'm about to say about it, I deserve very little credit for it. It was really set in motion and mostly put in place before I became the mayor, that there's still tons of work to be done. And it was really a member of City Council, Robin Rue Simmons, who represented the 5th Ward of Evanston in the previous 4 years, who carried the torch on this. So I don't want to be mistaken for taking credit where it's not due, but I am incredibly proud of the work our city is doing on this. So first of all, reparations is obviously something that's discussed a lot around the country, and I think it's usually discussed as kind of a theoretical thing. What would it mean? Why should we do it? Who's responsible for it? Do I really need to be a part of paying reparations because of something that maybe my ancestors did or didn't do? There's all these questions that are looming, and they're ethical questions and political questions and values questions, and they're practical questions, and there's legal questions. And what Evanston decided, really under the leadership of Councilmember Rue Simmons, was, those questions are really critical. And we're going to need to keep on discussing those questions. And it's going to be years, frankly, that we're going to have to talk that through. But we can't afford to wait until all of those questions are answered perfectly, because they're never going to be totally resolved. We also have to be willing to take a first step. And so that's what Evanston has done, is taken a first tangible step toward actually providing reparations. So let me just, if you don't mind, say a word about how it works, because there's a trillion questions you might have. First of all, and this is really critical, as strongly as I personally feel, and I think most Evanstonians and most people feel about the heinous crime of slavery, we don't believe that Evanston has the tools to be the entity to repair the harm that was done by slavery. So that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what we're doing here. But unfortunately, the city of Evanston itself has taken action that also caused significant harm that needs to be repaired. So there was a really powerful research that was done by a local archivist that documented all of the actions taken by the city of Evanston between 1919 and 1969. And I mean that the city of Evanston as a government, the corporate body itself, that really exacerbated black-white gaps, and particularly around housing. So this was a time that segregation was the norm, that redlining was happening, that racist homeowners associations had exclusionary covenants, that realtor groups were steering African-American buyers in one direction and white buyers in a different direction. All that stuff happened without the city of Evanston's cooperation, but there were a number of concrete ways the city of Evanston was cooperating and was involved in enforcing this stuff. And so the argument goes, hey, listen, we took specific actions that exacerbated the black-white wealth gap, and so we have a moral responsibility to repair that harm that we did. And then the second part of this is that in the middle of those discussions, cannabis was legalized, and so that created a new revenue stream, sales tax from cannabis. And given the racist ramifications, if not perhaps even intent, of the war on drugs, it seems like using that revenue to repair this harm made sense as well. And so the basic program is the first $10 million that come in from cannabis sales tax revenue will be put in a reparations fund, and that fund will be allocated to close these gaps and repair parts of the harm that the city government did. Now, of the $10 million, only the first $400,000, the first 4%, has actually been allocated, and that's being, the applications have come in for that now. So there's a ton of decisions left to make about how to spend this money, how to best engage in the real work of repair. But the fact that we're willing and able to take these first tangible steps, I think, is a really critical thing for our community.
And to look at it in kind of a specific way, so the eligible people get 25,000, sort of a housing allowance, is it? I mean, it's not a cash payment, but it can be used for a down payment, home repairs, etc.
Great question. So the $10 million commitment is sort of relatively high level. It's for reparations, and it talks about the different inequities that have been perpetuated by the city around housing and education and health and so forth. The first 4% that's been allocated is a specific program. And the way that program works is if you're eligible, and you're eligible based on being an Evanston resident who's a descendant of an Evanston resident who lived here at the time when those acts were perpetrated by the city, or perhaps you yourself lived here then if you're of that age, an eligible resident can qualify for a $25,000 grant toward a down payment on a home or toward rehab of a home. And the point is, hey, since the most clearly documented nexus between city action and these inequities is in the area of housing, folks thought that the first step toward repair ought to be in the area of housing.
And then I know you've talked about further steps. I mean, what are some of the things that are contemplated? How does this, what is a discussion about how this program might expand?
Well, I think you got to think in concentric circles out from where we are now. How different do we want to be? The first thing to say is this initial $400,000 is not a lot of money, and there were way more applications than there were slots. So you could even just do more of that exact thing. The next sort of more different thing you might say is, hey, let's stay in the housing field, but some folks don't own or don't plan to own rental assistance or landlord assistance. There's other ways to assist other populations in the housing field. And then further out, you might say, what about other areas where the city is documented to have exacerbated these inequities, like in education, for instance, like in public health? Should we set up a parallel program in those areas? And then the last thing to say, and you alluded to this earlier, is there absolutely is a constituency that believes passionately that reparations must be a cash payment. That to make it a part of a program that says, here's how you spend the money, is necessarily too restrictive and patronizing. And really, the way to repair the harm is to give someone a cash payment that allows them to determine what their needs are with those funds. And so I think all those different things are going to be on the table. We have a reparations committee of 7 people who right now is focused on getting out that first 4% of the funding, but they will be really taking the lead and then figuring out what's to be done with the next tranche of resources.
And I thought I saw in one of your white papers on your website that there's some tax implications with a cash payment that need to be thought through pretty clearly. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And so there's some people who passionately believe that a cash payment is morally necessary. There's others who believe that equally passionately that a cash payment is impractical. Some for tax reasons, right? So perhaps, so there's a strong argument to be made that a cash payment would be taxable income, whereas these other forms of in-kind help are not, at least if you structure them properly. Additionally, I think some people have legal concerns. I mean, there's no question we're going to be sued. The second a check is cut here, we're going to be sued. Threats have already been made. I expect those threats will be followed up on. And we need to design a program that we believe is as strongly defendable in court as possible. There's no question that when you are allocating resources based upon race, and there are explicit racial definitions in this program, you're exposing yourself to legal threat. And so the defense here is that this is not random race-based allocation of resources. It's a specific repair of a harm that was caused by us as a city government. And so that, and I'm not a lawyer to be clear at all, but what some attorneys tell me is that once you're going down that path of defense, there is an argument to be made that connecting the benefit to the harm as closely as possible could be helpful in mounting a legal defense.
Let's talk for a second about Northwestern and its importance to Evanston. And I said an older brother went to Northwestern, so I spent a lot of time up there back in the day. And I gathered that, like a lot of communities that have a major university, there's enormous benefits, also inevitable tensions. I think there's always a discussion if Northwestern is making as much a contribution to Evanston as it should. I think also in the reparations realm, there's the discussion about whether Northwestern should add a revenue stream to this. Tell me about how you look at Northwestern and its role in Evanston's life.
Well, just like you said it, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's Evanston. First of all, Evanston and Northwestern have a not just a deep relationship, but a long relationship, right? In fact, John Evans, who turns out to have been an absolute monstrosity of a person, but that's a different story. John Evans, after whom Evanston is named, was the founder of the university. Um, and so, and Northwestern is in the city charter. And so we have a very, very, very long, deeply intertwined relationship. And I think fundamentally Evanston doesn't thrive without a thriving Northwestern, and Northwestern doesn't thrive without a thriving Evanston. I think those things are clear. And so ultimately, I think these two institutions need to root for each other's success. And I can explain why and all that if you're interested, but I think it's probably pretty obvious to a lot of folks. On the other hand, there are inevitable tensions, and those tensions are real. Some of them are just about cash, right? It's a giant institution that occupies a ton of our land and consumes city services and doesn't pay property tax. And we have high property taxes. And so people look around and say, well, now hold on, that's, challenging for me to pay such high property taxes when that giant institution over there doesn't pay anything. Like most affluent private schools, Northwestern makes some payments to the city of Evanston. I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made that compared to their financial peers, they pay quite a lot less than others do. And, every time there's an article in the New Haven, Connecticut newspaper about the enormous amount of money that Gale is giving New Haven, I get some emails from constituents saying, well, now hold on. Why isn't Northwestern doing something similar? And it's a fair question. And so, there are plenty of issues where we sit across the table from each other, and my job is to drive a hard bargain. And I do that strongly. But I do it with an understanding that the best outcome is an outcome where we both do well, because again, a thriving Northwestern brings people and energy and ideas and frankly dollars to the city of Evanston as well.
Mr. Mayor, let's go to a couple of questions. We have a question from Mary in Carbondale, who said mayors of at least 30 cities are supporting the idea of guaranteed incomes. And just ask what your thoughts are. I know Evanston actually has a pilot project in this area. Tell us how that works and what your thoughts are about it.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm very excited about this. And I'm actually I'm a member of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And when I last checked, I was the only Illinois mayor who was a member of that, though that may have changed. It's actually a very useful group that provides a lot of assistance. So the idea of a guaranteed income is, basically that we have focused so much of our kind of social programmatic thinking on how to design specific programs for specific people that we've forgotten that just giving people money is incredibly efficient. It's efficient, it's simple, and this is not an idea that's been tried for that long in this country, but the first recent big pilot in Stockton, California, had great outcomes that genuinely showed that the folks who were given these cash payments, and I think there it was $500 a month, had really significant changes in their outcomes on a variety of different measurements. So that's the basic idea. And we're doing a pilot. And this is, by the way, a partnership with Northwestern. Northwestern provided the seed money of $300,000, and the city topped it up with $700,000 of Federal Rescue Plan Act funding. And it's going to be a year-long pilot to provide $500 monthly payments to, 150 residents who are coming from 3 different categories. One will be seniors, one will be the undocumented, and one will be disconnected youth, which we talked earlier about in the public safety context. And we're going to be doing it in partnership with really strong research from Northwestern to evaluate what works and what doesn't. And hopefully it'll work well, and we'll build a case for doing more of it in the future. But if it doesn't, that'll be an important lesson as well. So it's a really exciting idea. And I think, there was such a shift in this country in the 80s, especially, of kind of demonizing welfare and making it seem like if the government gives people money, then the money will be wasted and people will game the system, that we forgot that if you spend, $1 million designing a program that gets $400,000 of help to people, that's a lot more wasteful than anything that would just involve simpler cash payments. So I'm excited about what I think this could mean.
I have a question from Rockford Valerie, and we've had lots of questions on reparations, but hers is somewhat emblematic. She said, why just African Americans? Why not others, Native Americans? Why penalize modern day taxpayers who had no role in slavery, nor to their 20th century immigrant ancestors? Answer that as you will, Mr.
No, it's a
Mayor.
great question, Valerie. It's a totally fair question. And I think, I think it's important to be willing to enter into these conversations openly. So to me, the critical thing here is that the city of Evanston has documented specific acts that we took as a city government to enforce segregation. And there is tons of evidence that that segregation that occurred, let's say 2 generations ago, is reverberating in the wealth gap that exists today. And so that to me is the key point. So I'll give you a counterexample. I'm Jewish. Jews were not really welcome in the neighborhood I live in today, in Evanston. And I don't know the history well, but I wouldn't be surprised if the city government helped make sure that that happened. But there's no documented connection between that and any inequities that exist today. And so there's no harm that was done to me by the city of Evanston. It's just a shameful act in the past. But what we have today is the shameful acts that the city of Evanston perpetrated are reverberating today. And there's a gap today in, for example, housing value that occurs because of the segregation that the city of Evanston itself perpetrated. So I feel like we owe a debt. And that we owe a debt as the city. It's not that I personally, as a taxpayer, owe the debt. I wasn't here when those things happened, but it doesn't matter. I'm part of the city, and the city did those things, and people are hurting today because of them. And so we have an obligation to repay that debt. And so that's the lens or the test I would use when asking other questions about similar things one might do. Does that mean there's no other similar program that we ought to create? No, it doesn't mean that. We ought to ask those questions honestly, and particularly when it comes to Indigenous people, given John Evans' history. I think there's a really important conversation to be had. But I don't think it's just about any inequity or any unjust act. It's about the documented unjust acts that were carried out by the city itself that resulted in equities that are being felt today. And that's what says, hey, we've got this debt that we have to repay.
During most of our conversations with mayors, at some point, I hear a fairly passionate critique of Springfield, which is code for state government. So tell me, particularly having, worked 8 years in Springfield and now serving as mayor, as a mayor, what can Springfield do that it is not doing to help you better run the city of Evanston?
It's funny, right? Because we set up these systems with this sort of separation of powers. And of course, you hear about separation of powers about the Senate versus the House, and the executive versus the legislative, but the different layers of government are very, very similar. And it's very customary for municipal governments to complain about unfunded mandates. As a state legislator, I was supposed to complain to my congresswoman about unfunded mandates. And some of them are good and some of them are bad. Let me give you an example. Legislation passed in Springfield that was signed into law by Governor Pritzker this summer to mandate the replacement of every lead pipe, all the lead service lines over the course of the next 35 years. That is an unfunded mandate that's placed upon the city of Evanston from the state of Illinois. It's expensive, it's burdensome, it's going to be hard, and it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because lead is poison. It poisons children's brains. And so there was some pressure on me as a mayor to call my legislators and oppose that, and I declined because it's the right thing to do. Now, does that mean that Springfield's always right? No, let me tell you, I was there. They are not always right at all. But I think this sort of, tensions about mandates and funding, I think it's really beneficial, having been on both sides, that I can kind of see both sides of that. One thing that I think is really critical especially when you're talking about things that have financial consequences for municipalities, is Springfield operates on a ridiculous rhythm. right? So the legislative session ends at the end of May. And, the amount of work that's done between June 1st and May 25th in Springfield is probably less than the amount of work that's done between May 26th and May 31st. And when you're cramming your whole year's work into less than a week like that, it just means that things get rushed. And in the last minute, hugely important decisions can get made with essentially no consideration, because if a really, 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 really important thing is jammed into a bill with a slightly even more important thing, that number two thing kind of gets sort of lost in the shuffle. And so I think where everybody could be served better by Springfield, and local government is a clear example of this, is if something's super important to a constituency, make sure we're at the table. Make sure that we're talking through the consequences. Be willing to do something we don't like, but only because you understand exactly why we don't like it, and you've thought through the costs and benefits, and you're willing to do it. Not because, oh, well, it's 11:45 and the session adjourns in 15 minutes, so I guess we got to vote yes. So that would be my plea on behalf of municipalities, on behalf of local governments, but on behalf of all constituencies, just to make sure that the abruptness and the rash nature of the policymaking process doesn't create really serious problems.
Well, we could go on for a long time. We have lots to talk about, but let me ask you finally, I mean, how do you like to relax and unwind? I see a lot of books behind you. Are those relaxation and unwinding? Or so tell me a little bit about how you, Evanston obviously has some amazing lakefront. I'm sure that'd be nice to get out there. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do love to read. I actually, it's funny. I think mostly you've got nonfiction behind me, and for a lot of my life in public service, I just read only nonfiction. I realized 6 months ago, I miss fiction. So I've started to kind of diversify my reading a little bit. I'm reading novels again. It's very exciting. I've family. My kids are 11 and 13. We love to still spend time together while we can. I do love the outdoors. Love to be on the lakefront in the summertime. Love to run when I'm disciplined enough and the weather's good enough. And our family has recently taken up rock climbing as a sort of surprising hobby. So that's been terrifying, but also delightful.
Great. Well, Mr. Mayor, when COVID allows, we would love to coax you back to Carbondale and visit with the community, students at SIU. The Institute would love to host you for a conversation, because there's so much interesting things that you're involved in that we'd like to learn more about.
I would love that. I've loved every visit to Carbondale. Growing up in a Midwestern public university college town, I feel real at home in Carbondale. And my great friend, I can't let a meeting with the Paul Simon Institute end without talking about my great friend Sheila Simon, who I love to have an excuse to visit as well. So when the health protocols make sense, say the word, and I'll be there.
Okay, well, we'll have to time that with the performance of one of Sheila's band. Maybe we could have her do a concert or something.
Perfect. I'll be in the front row.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, John.
Great. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Meet the Mayor. We will have this video on our website and on YouTube tomorrow, so please look at it and show it to your family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.